evening. You're very welcome. I'd like to welcome you all to this launch, and it's great to see such a very full room. To this launch of this really very important book, Measuring Poverty Around the World, which is Tony Atkinson's final book. So, my name is Brian Nolan, and I lead the Inequality and Prosperity program here at the Oxford Martin School. So I'll be acting as chair for the event, as well as contributing to the discussion. I've some welcomes to start with, but I'd like to start and very warmly welcome Tony's wife, Judith, who will say a few words in a moment. It's great to have you here. And also to welcome Tony's collaborators and friends who are also here. And I won't go through the list, but you know who you are, and it's great that you're here too. And as I know from happy experience, you couldn't work with Tony without becoming his friend. So before we get to the evening's proceedings, sort of properly underway, there's a couple of formal announcements, if you like, that I have to make. The first is that the event, including the Q&A, is being filmed and live webcast. So take that into account as you wish. The second and more upbeat one is that the talk will be followed by drinks and a book sale and books next door in the lecture theatre just to the right. In the cafe just to the right of the lecture theatre, and the books are there for you to access. So just to mention that this is indeed a particularly appropriate venue to be having this event, because it was here in this lecture theatre that Tony presented the report he wrote for the World Bank on monitoring global poverty, and joined in what was a fascinating discussion that many of you may have attended indeed of its contents in what was very sadly his last such public event. John Micklewright will be explaining the way in which working on that highly influential report led Tony to work so hard on this book that's being launched today, despite the illness that prevented him from completing it. John and Andrea Brandolini, who unfortunately very much wanted to be here but had to cancel at the last minute, have brought the book to publication. And they can't be thanked sufficiently for doing so, and for the outstanding care and judgment that they exercised in this challenging task. So I'll introduce John and Professor Sabina Alkire, who will also be speaking in a moment, but let me first hand over to Judith Atkinson to say a few words.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you everybody who's come. As I'm sure you can imagine, my heart is very full on this occasion. And when I saw these pictures of Tony and of our family, I did burst into tears and I nearly ran away, but I'm very glad I haven't. I'm standing here where Tony stood when he launched his book, after which he said that he hoped the World Bank would appoint somebody who would be responsible for implementing and assessing the measures which he'd outlined in the book. I have to say that he then staggered over there and had to be helped off the stage. It was the last time he appeared in public. But his memory and his work have lived on. As most of you probably know, he had a very serious, rather rare cancer, and sadly he had a particularly aggressive form of that cancer. We were warned when he was first diagnosed that the DNA of the cancer was particularly drug resistant. So rather than the 10, 20 years, which obviously isn't, it cuts a life short, the 10, 20 years which many myeloma sufferers managed to survive, he lived for 3 years and 3 months, and his last 2 months were very difficult. But he wanted to write this. He really wanted to. At first he said he couldn't chair the report because he wasn't going to go to America and he didn't want all the long conversations. But in fact, all the conversations were by telephone or by email. And they said to him that he could write the report himself and have sole responsibility for it, which he was glad to do. But of course, he couldn't have sole responsibility at the later stage for bringing it to publication. And I do want to say a huge thank you to John, who's a very old friend and has worked with Tony, and whose wife Tina is also here and who is a good friend of mine. And to Andrea, who isn't able to come. I'm more grateful than I can say. Over the last year or so, they have sent me things, and I'm afraid I've been a bit ungracious. I've emailed back and said, I'm sorry, I don't think I can read much of this. It's too painful. But since then, I have read as much as I can follow of the book. I have to say, Inequality, What Can Be Done was easier to follow, possibly because I'd had more input into it. But here is the book. I hope it's going to bear fruit. It's obviously got 4 already on the cover. My huge thanks to you, John, and to Andrea, and to Louisa, Andrea's wife, and Tina, John's wife, and to everybody who's worked to help Tony with this, and to Brian and everybody at the Oxford Martin School for the organisation. Now, I hope I'm not going to fall off the stage, so thank you for listening to me, and thank you for coming.
Thanks very much, Judith, and welcome, Richard. Let me introduce John Micklewright, who is Professor Emeritus of Economics and Social Statistics in the Department of Social Science at UCL's Institute of Education, a department that he headed, and was previously Professor of Social Statistics at the University of Southampton, Head of Research at UNICEF in Florence, Professor of Economics at Queen Mary, and Professor of Economics at the European University Institute in Florence. Before that, he was Prize Research Fellow at Nuffield College, as we were discussing before we came out. So I've had the good fortune to know John since we were fellow students at the LSE some time ago, being supervised by Tony. And I have to say, John made it all look so easy, and he has continued to do so ever since. He collaborated extensively with Tony on their path-breaking book, Economic Transformation in Eastern Europe and the Distribution of Income, and on a whole range of other topics. And with Stephen Jenkins co-edited Inequality and Poverty Re-Examined, book published by OUP, which was a collection by Tony's former students in his honour, and a Festschrift in all but name. So no one better to tell us about bringing this book to publication than John. And we're then going to have some reflections on the material in the book from Sabina Alkire, who directs the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, OPHI, which is a research centre within the Department of International Development here in Oxford. Sabina is a distinguished research affiliate of the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at Notre Dame, and her work with James Foster on the development of multidimensional poverty measurement analysis has been enormously influential and features extensively in the book that we're discussing today, as we will hear much more about. Tony was a great supporter of this work, and we're fortunate to be able to get Sabina's reflections on the book. I'll then say a few words about it myself. We'll give John the opportunity to respond to what he's heard, and then open it up for plenty of wider discussion. So without further ado, I'll hand over to John.
Good. Well, thanks very much, Brian, and thanks very much, Judith, and thanks very much too to the Oxford Martin School for putting on this event. Now, Tony is rightly seen as the leading scholar of modern research on inequality, and his 2015 magnus opus, Inequality, What Can Be Done, is often referred to as his last book. The good news, of course, you already know, is that a new Atkinson book was published in June on the subject of poverty. And this book comes exactly 50 years after Tony's first book, published in 1969, also on the subject of poverty. So Tony's first book was on poverty. There it is on the left. It was concerned with poverty in Britain, just Britain. 20 years later, Tony wrote a book that broadened the whole of Europe, a very nice little book, Poverty in Europe. And in the decade that followed that, he, along with others, including Brian, did much to advance the European Union's measurement of social indicators. But with this book, Tony's perspective turns truly global. Okay, I want to start by focusing on two words in the title. The first is measuring. Now, this is principally a book about measurement, something that Tony rightly saw as essential in the fight against poverty for various reasons: for motivating concern about poverty, for designing policy to combat it, to judge progress made in combating poverty, and something that was very important for Tony, to hold leaders to account for the goals that they have agreed to, notably the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, of which the very first goal is end poverty everywhere. But the book, in fact, is not only about measurement. The title is therefore a little restrictive, and that will become clearer when I describe the structure later on. The second word I want to focus on for a minute is around. This is a book about poverty around the world in two senses. The first sense is that it provides a guide to measurement that can be used in any country, rich or poor. So in this sense, around means anywhere in the world. And there are numerous examples in the book of national measurement of poverty, in part drawing on an appendix that was planned to have 60 case studies of national measurement of poverty in countries at all levels of development. The second sense the book is about poverty around the world is it provides a guide to how you could arrive at a global total for poverty. So around here means sort of gathering together of all countries. So how many poor people are there in the world? What are the steps needed to arrive at such a total? And critically, what are the assumptions that lie behind those calculations? Okay, having said that the book is not just about measuring poverty, what are the key themes in this, its principal focus of measurement? Well, the first one I've already noted, that the importance of measurement. The second is that poverty can be interpreted in different ways. As Tony said, it's a contested concept. And those differing views about poverty have differing implications for how poverty should be measured. Thirdly, the book stresses that poverty is multifaceted. It's not just a question of a low level of your income or your consumption. Fourthly, good data are vital. That's a major theme of the book, and Tony cites the World Bank president as having said, collecting good data is one of the most powerful tools to end extreme poverty. And he notes that huge progress has been made, but much more is needed. And finally, Tony calls for the systematic comparison of measurement by national bodies, ministries, statistical offices, with the measurement done by international organizations such as the World Bank or the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP. And he argues that that serves two purposes. Firstly, it provides a cross-check on the conclusions shown by different methods or sources about how poverty has changed over time, or about the composition of the poor, where any inconsistencies that can't be explained must sound as a warning bell to users of either set of data. And secondly, he argues that comparison provides legitimacy to both sources of measurement, national and international, and eventually to the policy decisions that are based on those measurements. Well, as Brian and Judith have explained, the book grew out of Tony's work writing the 2016 report of the World Bank's Commission on Global Poverty, which he chaired and which he wrote single-handed. And the book draws on that report, but it goes well beyond it and is much broader in its aims. The report was written to advise the World Bank on its measurement of poverty and was restricted to discussing methods with little or no analysis of data. Whereas the book starts from first principles about what we mean by poverty. It then translates those principles into concrete measures, and then finally analyzes the data to which the measures can be applied. And as I noted, it also addresses substantive issues of which the World Bank report was on which the World Bank report was silent, alongside its discussion of methods and its analysis of poverty data. Now, in planning his book, Tony placed a big emphasis, as I've already stressed, on documenting countries' own national measurements and on the comparison of these with the measurements done by international organizations. And I just want to illustrate that point with a graph from the book for rural China that shows poverty rates plotted on the vertical axis against time over a period of some 40 years. Now, there are three series in that graph that are labeled national. They are poverty rates estimated by the Chinese National Bureau of Statistics. And then there's one series calculated by the World Bank based on its $1.90 per day per person in purchasing power parity terms, absolute poverty line. And that's the solid line with squares, and you can notice in the late 1980s, there's a break in that series where the World Bank switched from using income to measure poverty to using consumption to measuring poverty. And we can see a gap in the series there. And Tony was very careful about this sort of issue, not to, as we say in the book, join up the dots, as we say in our foreword, when he wasn't convinced that a series was consistent over time. Now, the good news is there's good broad agreement about the huge fall there's been in poverty in rural China between the series currently used by the Chinese, the series 3 in the diagram with the circles with the grey shaded centres. Very broad agreement between that and the World Bank series. So that's good. But Tony was particularly interested in recent developments. And I've circled there at the end the group of dots that include the change between 2012 and 2013, where he noted these differences have a major impact on your estimates of the change in world poverty. The World Bank poverty rate there falls by nearly 10 percentage points in 1 year, whereas the National Bureau of Statistics series falls by less than 2 percentage points. Now, if you translate that into absolute numbers, that means the World Bank series was falling by some 63 million people. So 63 million less poor people in rural China. And that made up over half the total world fall in poverty in that year. Whereas the National Bureau of Statistics figures falls by less than 20 million. So which series you take has a huge impact on your conclusion about what's happened to world poverty in that year. Now, we argue, Andrea and I in our forward, that this is a classic Atkinson volume, this book. And we place it in the forward within the sort of arc of Tony's career and his huge research output starting before that first book in 1969, but that was the first book 50 years before this one. And we discuss the progression in Tony's sort of intellectual contribution and argument in the measurement of poverty, both theoretical and empirical, across that 50 years. Now, Tony left an incomplete draft and asked Andrea and I to take it forward. And we quickly decided that completing the book would be impossible. There was too much left to do, especially in the book's second half. And we might have imposed our own ideas and co-authored the book, and that's something the Atkinsons encouraged us to think about. But we were clear from the outset that this book should remain Tony's alone, and not be co-authored by us. So with the agreement of the Atkinsons, we decided to bring the book to a state where it could be published while remaining incomplete. So we edited Tony's material. We added some new material in the ways that we describe in the forward. And we invited Nick Stern and Françoise Bourguignon, both long-standing friends and co-authors of Tony, to write to afterwards to deal with topics that Tony wanted to cover, but where he ran out of time to do so. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. Well, it remains an unfinished book, but it's got over 400 pages, some 90 graphs and tables. It weighs about 100 grams more than Inequality, What Can Be Done. It's a substantial book. It remains unfinished, but the unfinished chapters offer a foundation on which other researchers can build, and indeed a challenge to them to do so. Now let's have a look at the contents of the book in more detail. Well, the slide shows 10 chapter titles, 4 of which, chapters 6 to 9, have a focus on particular regions or groups of countries. 2 afterwards, genesis of which I've described. And then a substantial appendix with 60 national reports, national poverty reports, as Tony called them, for a range of countries from all over the world, rich and poor. And these are 2-page accounts, concise 2-page accounts of national measurement of poverty, with a graph comparing trends over time for those national poverty measures with measures produced by international organizations, notably the World Bank and the UNDP. And I've shown you the graph for rural China. There are 2 graphs for China, rural China and urban China, from those national reports. And the book is an example of what you'd call Tony's principled approach to research that he followed throughout his career. Namely, that there's no measurement without theory behind it. Conversely, the theoretical developments are valuable only to the extent that they're liable to be applied in practice. And thirdly, behind this whole exercise of measurement, researchers have a duty to make explicit the ethical judgments that are embedded in their chosen measures. Now, the first chapter illustrates that principled approach straight away, especially the role of ethical judgments. Now, if you take estimates of world poverty, such as those made by the World Bank, using its $1.90 a day poverty line, they invariably weight each poor person around the world equally. So you take the number of poor people beneath the $1.90 a day line in China, you add that to the number of people beneath the line in Brazil, beneath the line in South Africa, beneath the line in the USA, and just add these all up, weighting them equally. And Tony describes that as a cosmopolitan approach to estimating global poverty, and much of the book's discussion and estimates of total world poverty is based on that ethical judgment that people should be weighted equally. But he offers alternatives, notably what he calls a limited sympathy approach, in which you give full weight to the poor within your own country, and then a weight less than 1 to the poor outside your own national borders. And that, of course, has the implication that the global poverty total varies with the country where the calculation is being made. So there's a nationally specific count of world poverty. Chapter 2 presents different approaches to measuring poverty: subjective assessments based on judging what a household's basic needs are, Amartya Sen's capability approach, and finally assessments based on principles of human rights, where we note that we think Tony would have added more in time, perhaps commenting on the approach taken by the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. It's Philip Alston currently, whose recent report in May of this year, following his visit to the UK in November, received such a lot of attention. Chapter 2 also introduces an idea for measurement of a global total based on work that Tony did 20 years ago with Françoise Bourguignon, where they proposed that a poverty line for application across the world is an absolute one at lower levels of development, and then at a certain point begins to rise as national income rises. Something they rationalise, thinking theory behind measurement always, they rationalise using Sen's capability approach, but also note that it reflects what has long been seen to be the case in practice, not surprisingly, that national poverty lines rise with income. So here's a graph taken from the, not from the book, but from the 2018 edition of the World Bank's biennial publication, flagship publication, Poverty and Shared Prosperity. And that's a report full of analysis that takes on board Tony's recommendations for measurement in the report of the Commission on Global Poverty, including this particular recommendation based on his work 20 years ago with Françoise Bourguignon. Now, we've got poverty lines plotted on the vertical axis in purchasing power dollars per person per day, and then average income plotted on the horizontal axis in the same measure, and each of those dots represents a poverty line at some point in time for a country. Now, here's the World Bank's $1.90 a day poverty line. If you apply that everywhere in the world, it's somewhat higher than a good bunch of poor countries. They're clustered at the left-hand side of the diagram, but it's clearly a lot lower than the poverty lines used in many other countries that are richer than that. And one of Tony's suggestions in the book is to have a poverty line that instead is like this. So it starts at $1.90, gets up, in fact, in this case, to $3. Once you get to a median income of average income of $3.80, then it rises at the rates of 50 cents in the dollar. And as you can see, that particular proposal that he made fits these data that the World Bank has shown in their recent report on poverty lines, data on poverty lines quite well. Obviously, key things here are where that kink point comes and the rate at which the line rises. Now, chapters 3 and 4 then build what Tony calls a checklist of the questions he believed one should ask when faced with any statistics on poverty. He makes frequent references here to the 60 national reports at the end of the book to illustrate his arguments. Chapter 3 focuses on clarifying the concepts. So if a monetary measure is being used, should that be income? Should that be consumption? And how are those two concepts defined? If the aim is to arrive at a global total, how do you adjust for differences across countries in the cost of living using a purchasing power parity exchange rate? What about non-monetary indicators? For example, the absence of a particular item in the home or lack of access to clean water. And Tony wanted to give a lot of prominence to these measures of poverty. He noted that the targets under the Sustainable Development Goals poverty targets refer to reducing poverty, quote, in all its dimensions. So what indicators are chosen in practice to pick up the dimensions, say, health or education, and how are they combined into a single measure? Should they be combined into a single measure? So Tony's here in practice discussing in particular the measures developed, as Brian has already noted, by Sabina and her colleagues at the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative that for several years now have been published by the UN in the Human Development Report of UNDP. And he also discusses the measures produced by Eurostat for EU countries, measures of material deprivation. Chapter 4 then considers the data underlying the statistics on poverty. What are they? Do real data exist, or are they actually just imputations? And how comparable are data across countries and across time? Now, chapter 5 marks a transition in the book from considering concepts, possible measures, available data, to analysis of existing data. And here the book begins to get much less complete. One thing Tony wanted to do here in this chapter was compare estimates of monetary poverty produced by the World Bank based on the $1.90 a day line with the non-monetary measures of poverty published by the UNDP in collaboration with Sabina and her colleagues. Now, these non-monetary measures of poverty, non-monetary poverty rates, are based on bringing together indicators of education, health, and household conditions. So the question is, do they tell the same sort of story as the monetary measures of the World Bank? So drawing on Tony's notes and files, we included some limited analysis of the data along the lines that he had already started, and we point to the directions that we think he might have taken with that analysis. And this diagram is one that we found in Tony's files. It plots the poverty rate estimates by Sabina and her colleagues on the vertical axis, the non-monetary poverty rates, against the World Bank's poverty rates on the horizontal axis, based on the $1.90 a day poverty line. And there are some 70 countries in that graph with the rates, there's two rates being based on the same year for each country. Now, broadly speaking, the two sets of rates move up together as shown by the line, the curved line that Tony superimposed on his graph. But there are countries that are a long way away from that line. So take Swaziland and Chad, where the World Bank $1.90 a day line is essentially the same, but there are these huge differences in non-monetary poverty rates. Or compare Mauritania, there on the left-hand side of the diagram, and Zambia and Rwanda on the right-hand side, both with non-monetary rates of some 55 to 60%, but with monetary rates that are very, very different. And we think Tony would have delved into explaining those differences and trying to resolve those apparent paradoxes. And we also note we think he would have looked at trends in the two sets of data. Do they tell the same story over time. That's a subject that Sabina and colleagues have looked into themselves. Now, in chapters 6 to 9, Tony intended to do two things. Firstly, he wanted to use the data he had assembled in the 60 national reports at the end of the book to answer a standard set of what he called key questions about poverty levels and poverty trends for each of the 4 regions or groups of countries listed there. And in each case, he planned to compare the evidence from the national studies with estimates from the international agencies, drawing on all those graphs in his national poverty reports of the type that I showed you for rural China. But as with chapter 5, much of the analysis that he had planned here is missing. The same is true for most of the second thing that Tony planned for these 4 chapters. He was to consider what he called a series of general issues, 2 per chapter, different for each chapter, about either the causes and correlates of poverty or about its measurement. And if you look at those subjects, these are not minor issues, they're big issues. And the discussion, indeed, was not to be restricted to just the countries that made up the region or group with which a chapter was principally concerned. So chapter 6, titled Asia, this discussion here of these 2 topics was not just going to be about Asia, it was going to be cross-cutting across the world. So there was ambitious and complex structure for these chapters. Now, Andrea and I decided that the first 2 of these general issues, those for chapter 6, the ones that Tony clearly saw as probably the most important, really should be covered in the book, and hence our invitation to Françoise Bourguignon and Nick Stern to write there afterwards, which have really added to the book. They're both about 4,000 or 5,000 word essays at the back of the book. Nick Stern writing on the relationship between efforts to reduce climate change, to halt climate change, and efforts to reduce poverty. And Françoise Bourguignon writing on the relationship, the interrelationship between poverty, inequality, and economic growth. Now, one of the issues that was to be dealt with in chapter 9 was the estimation of global totals of monetary poverty based on that poverty line that I mentioned earlier that he and Françoise Bourguignon had worked out originally 20 years ago, in which the World Bank have now become now included in their analysis and their reports. One with an absolute line to begin with that then rises. And Tony here made substantial progress, providing estimates for 2013 based on 2 different lines, yielding figures of over 1 billion in one case and 2 billion people in the other case living in poverty. Chapter 10 concludes, and Tony finishes in a characteristic upbeat way, his innate optimism on display. As far as the measurement of poverty is concerned, he argues that this cannot be static and that researchers from different disciplines have to be broad-minded. But at the same time, he concludes that despite the holes in the data and their variable quality, in broad terms, the evidence around the world is sufficient in the sense that policymakers in most countries cannot say they don't know enough in order to tackle poverty. And one section in this chapter indeed is titled, "We Know Enough to Act." Tony argues that what is lacking is actually political will. And here we are coming back to the point he makes at the start of the book about the importance of measuring poverty, that politicians have accepted ambitious goals for tackling poverty that are embodied in the Sustainable Development Goals. They've signed up to them. And now we need to hold politicians to account, with measurement being vital for that. Thank you.
It is indeed touching to be in this room where Tony launched the report monitoring global poverty of the commission that he chaired, and I'm so glad, Judith, that you didn't run away. It's lovely to be here and to be together and to recognize that many of you really have contributed in so many ways to the work that is under discussion. I remember the deep impact that commission report had and continues to have as it reverberates in different places and catches attention and new winds at different times. And I think that this book, similarly, really will continue to reverberate in many minds. And it reminds us also, again, of the research style we value so much, how research was approached with utmost detail to the literature and to the data, but also with an eye to the colleagues, and also with an insistent focus on those who could act using it. So it's deeply inspiring at many levels. And I think what is also inspiring is, in a sense, how it is pulled together by John and by Andrea. And really, I echo Brian's remarks of gratitude and regard for the tremendous job that they did. I begin with a little bit less serious quote from the book, which is, it's from the preface, and it's citing the cover note to the Rolling Stones album, Pure Blue Lonesome, that suggests that their popularity was because they had listened to some records. And so in a quiet, accessible, and non-confrontational way, the book might steer those who work on poverty to read around, to look for new breakthroughs, to welcome and have their work fertilized by others' moments of inspiration. And I think many of you have done that, and this book is very much the product of a community that is doing that and that encourages more of the same. In what follows the text are quotations from the book, and the page numbers are provided, and at 3 points I do little graphics of work that we've done trying to implement some of the points in the book a little bit further. And I'd like to begin with just two general observations, which were already mentioned, about the motivation of the book. And one has to do with why you should read the book. It articulates poverty as being one of the two great global challenges alongside climate change, which Nick Stern's essay then rightly addresses. And therefore, because it is a challenge, a common problem, then the evidence in the book about the extent and nature of poverty is provided to spur action to design effective policies. And so there's a very clear logic, I think, that threads through and which is refreshing and quite different than other books on the subject. Again, a section entitled The Link with Action, and a recognition that it's this link with action that marks studies on poverty as distinctive in the social sciences. Poverty statistics matter because they motivate people to tackle a key challenge. And so yes, the research is important. Yes, getting the axioms or getting the measures right is important, but also making a measure that's legible to those who are busy doing other things, but whose work would actually reduce poverty. And so it's this recognition of the community of people who are, in a sense, working from different angles on the same problem, which is quite interesting. And very consciously then, chapters, different examples document the handover between researcher studies and action, JFK with Harrigan, Jacques Delors with O'Higgins and Stephen Jenkins, cases in Ireland, Tanzania, World Bank or UNDP, where there was a successful conversation that went on, and in a sense implicitly suggesting that those who work in this field also try to be a bit more creative in imagining who their conversation partners are. And then a very simple, straightforward, but yet lucid observation, which is distinctive in a sense for me of the book, that if there are global targets in the Sustainable Development Goals, that we already know there are, and if the one on poverty is to end poverty in all its forms, then we need to be able to monitor it. Because if we can't, the political commitment has no force. And so John Micklewright made that point, but it's made so simply and clearly, I thought it was worth mentioning again. The second observation I'd have is basically about the checklist. So working from a measurement perspective, we often talk of, okay, we need to identify the space in which we want to measure poverty. And then we need to think of how to identify people as poor with a poverty line or another algorithm. And then we need to figure out which measure to use, head count ratio or another one, and what are the axioms that they satisfy and why should they be used. But this book complements it with a checklist. And it's a different checklist from the other books I've seen. And the interesting thing is both the content, which John went through very well, but also the audience. So this is a book written for the general public and written for people who are looking at poverty metrics to try to make sure that they understand what that poverty number is conveying. But for the research community then, it's putting the onus on us very quietly to provide all of those details when anything is written up, to be as transparent, as clear, and aware that people will rightly and should be asking these kinds of questions of how the measures are built. And there should be this interest in the underlying structure of measurement itself. And I think that that's very, very helpful because, again, it will widen the community and widen the conversation. In the rest of the time, I'd like to simply share a little bit of one theme through the book, not surprisingly, a theme on non-monetary poverty, but a theme that is presented in such a different way. It's quite, again, distinctive of the book in that it traces between the Sustainable Development global goals and the conversations in Europe, and does so just in a very natural way, shifting from one set of references to another, from one set of measures to another, but overall, charting a journey. And I think that that's a journey others haven't written in the same way. So it observes in chapter 1 that high-income countries have underlined the importance of having both monetary and non-monetary indicators. Then cites from Angus Deaton's Great Escape that escaping from poverty, if it's income or monetary poverty, is one aspect, but it's only part of what is important, whether it be for well-being or for poverty. So that there is, a comfort with the idea that non-monetary aspects of poverty are also of note. And that the subjective assessments draw, in the case of developing countries, on participatory data, and also similar trajectory in European studies on poverty, which Brian knows much more than I, is canvassed. And in a sense, drawn upon to give authorization or to underlie the significance of introducing non-monetary poverty alongside the much more familiar areas. Naturally, when it comes to conceptual frameworks, there are 4, as was mentioned, including human rights and also capabilities. And a recognition that Sen, from 1985 onwards, in the references cited here, frames poverty as a deprivation in capabilities. There's a lovely, elegant phrase, it's a roadblock, and you want to know the paths not traveled, but the paths not traveled because they're blocked, which is the simplest way I've ever heard of explaining the capability approach. That sentence is pure gold. And then also discussing how, because capabilities are concerned with the different deprivations that batter a poor person's life at the same time, as Sudhiranand and Amartya Sen put it, then a multidimensional measure comes natural for that conceptual framework, but also there could be others. And as was mentioned earlier, then there is this great interest in using the national case studies to triangulate, to see how different poverty measures, national or comparable, monetary or non-monetary, come up with the same or the different stories. And again, therefore, observing the rise of counting-based measures in Europe, beginning in the 1950s in Italy, going on to the much more well-known counting-based traditions, and up to, as was mentioned, the EU 2020 and the common frameworks for a portfolio of indicators. Multidimensional but not aggregated. And then the recognition that in the Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 1 and Target 1.2 reflect poverty in national definitions very explicitly. And the book recognizes many of the countries that at that point in time had adopted official multidimensional poverty statistics alongside their monetary statistics to have 2 different measures of poverty, both at the national level. And then there's a few sections which simply go into how a measure that might aggregate across dimensions is made or could be made, and a section on choice of dimensions which has many country examples and draws on them, but reiterates the 6 dimensions that were advocated in the Commission on Monitoring Global Poverty: health, education, nutrition, housing, personal security, and work. And it also looks at the multiple different kinds of conceptual frameworks and justifications for dimensions that could be drawn upon, ranging from subjective to legal to international standards, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And then again, for me, quite interestingly, drawing on all of the work that Tony did in Europe on understanding the indicators of poverty. In this context, there is another discussion of indicators that is, again, slightly different, much more tailored to the present context and conversation. And then a recognition here that monetary poverty measures draw primarily on household data and the non-monetary, as well as some household surveys, actually, but they might be able to illuminate intra-household inequalities in a different way. And that's one of the points that we have tried to then subsequently implement with Rizwan al-Haq and Abdul Alim and countries in South Asia, unpacking the child indicators of the global MPI to show the intra-household gendered patterns and also intra-household inequality among children who are deprived and not in the same household. Where there were contestation and debates, they were simply articulated, and that's certainly the case in terms of whether or not to aggregate into a measure. And so there was an observation that one number gets political attention, which was a motivation of the book, but that Amartya Sen had been skeptical about the vulgarity of aggregating a composite measure like the HDI, or that Martin Revalian had been skeptical about the assumptions and the weights required to compute the global multidimensional poverty measure. And yet, proceeding on, then there is a move to a multidimensional concept that again draws together the counting tradition in Europe and recognizes we can't just look at how many people are deprived, but how many deprivations they have going on at the same time. And that is, in a sense, the measurement approach that was advocated in Europe with the Material Deprivation Index, counting first 3 out of 9 or 4 out of 9, and then out of 13 in the revised version of that index. And the global MPI also adding general weights, and so not the same weights across them. And we did an exercise that wasn't available at the time of also looking at overlaps of the unweighted, equally weighted indicators in a paper with some colleagues at OPHI. And near to the end, then there is the discussion of weights, and a very interesting point there that in a multidimensional measure, on the one hand, you want a measure that's robust to a small or plausible range of weights, what is called local, because that, in a plural society, we will disagree. And then you also want measures that are not robust to general weights, because if they are, the multidimensionality is adding nothing. So that's generated for us the need to do 231 general weights and 21 plausible weights, which we have done, again, with colleagues at OPHI. And so I think, because I'm coming to time, I'll only say that the comparability across time and the trend analysis will hopefully also have a further spark of interest when we are able to provide comparisons for a much larger set of countries this year. So finally, to conclude, I'd like just to bring that interesting tapestry of work on non-monetary poverty, which brought together the European tradition and all of the different conversations there, and the conversations in more developing countries on multidimensional poverty. It brought it together in a novel way. And it seems from the conclusion that actually this relationship between monetary and non-monetary measures of poverty was of some interest. And one hopes that it continues to be, but with the spirit of the book, of great transparency, of being cross-fertilized by others' ideas, being terribly interested in triangulating our own data. For me, it's generated a huge interest in monetary poverty measures. But not everything is serious. And so the book conclusion also says that many years ago, there was an advertising campaign for a well-known beer that claimed to refresh the pots that other beers could not reach. To a significant extent, this is the role of non-monetary indicators of poverty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabina, and that gives me the perfect starting point because I was also struck by that quote, but I couldn't remember which beer it was. I'm sure somebody can illuminate that. But I did want to begin my short remarks by reiterating just what a service John and Andrea have done to us all by bringing the book so successfully to publication. It seems to me that the task Tony asked them to take on and that they embraced with great enthusiasm and perhaps with some well-merited trepidation wasn't at all an easy one. And that the care and judgment they've exercised amply demonstrate that Tony got it right in his ask. And I think I would urge you, while respecting their modesty in terms of not trying to act as co-authors or complete the book, if you like, I would urge you to spend significant time going through their very valuable footnotes, which do really helpfully suggest what Tony might well have wanted to include and to say. And they look like pretty good mind reading to me, which isn't surprising given how closely they both worked with Tony and talked through and teased through these topics with him. So I just want to spend a few minutes highlighting a few striking features of the book that of course link back to Tony's enormous and enormously impressive body of work on poverty and underline its importance. The first is, of course, as John has emphasized and is obvious to anyone who ever read anything he wrote, is that figures and measures are to serve a purpose rather than exist in their own right, if you like. Better measures of poverty are, among other things, intended to raise awareness, motivate action, and allow progress to be monitored. And there's also a brief discussion here, as there is in Inequality, what can be done, about why we should care in the first place. And I think I was struck by the fact that Tony is maybe a bit more explicit in this book than before about the importance, the centrality for him of intrinsic rather than instrumental reasons. Now, it isn't hard, as he points out, to produce and think of instrumental reasons why those in rich countries might fear the potential consequences of global poverty and indeed inequality for themselves, or to point to evidence that poverty and inequality in rich countries has a range of negative side effects here. But as Tony puts it in the book, I've never been a great fan of motivating concern about poverty or inequality in that way. Instead, his concerns were based on intrinsic arguments on the moral dimension. He explores these in the book only in the context that John mentioned of why those of us in richer countries should care about the poor elsewhere, and has a very interesting discussion about how such sympathy may be less than complete and the implications for how we might want to measure poverty. And as in Inequality, what can be done, he doesn't spell out or try to impose his own theory of justice or moral standpoint, characteristically leaving it to the reader to bring his or her own moral compass and judgments to bear. So the key then is that the information on which these judgments are made should be able to bear the weight. And I think here readers will be forcibly struck by the again characteristic combination of breadth of vision and absence of dogmatism about the range of information that might be helpful in assessing the extent and nature of poverty, and the strictness about the care with which the available data needs to be employed. He was very picky. The book devotes considerable space to discussing the role of non-monetary deprivation indicators, as Sabina has reflected on, and again, the discussion is very subtly balanced in terms of how such indicators can play an enormously helpful role alongside monetary ones. And in thinking about focusing on money versus other things, it's probably also worth reflecting on the centrality of the rights approach in thinking about these issues for Tony. And that extended, very importantly, to thinking about how income is sourced, and how in particular one is treated, if one is reliant on the state, how one is treated by the apparatus through which that income support is delivered. And that's one of the reasons why he was so interested in teasing through the role that a partial or full basic income could play, because he was horrified by the disempowering effect that, in particular, means testing can have on those affected. And it doesn't take any imagination to think about how he would have reacted to what we read very recently about this now. It's the computer that's saying no. It's not, you don't even have somebody that you can interact with here in the UK and more broadly, as indeed Philip Alston, who John mentioned, is currently working very hard on. So just to turn to data, it's worth remarking or noting again that Tony showed a degree of respect for the work of official statistical agencies and data collectors and collators that maybe isn't universal among academics. So his sympathy for the difficulties they face is illustrated by the entire chapter on the key role of data. And the nice quote it includes that struck me particularly from the director of the Trinidad and Tobago Statistics Office, that among the problems faced by survey fieldwork, principal are dogs and crime. I'm very pleased indeed that Sabina put up the combined checklist that covers both concepts and measures and requires the user, as she emphasized, to not only be clear about about precisely what is being measured, but also to probe crucial aspects of the quality of the data being used, and, as John put it, not join up the dots when they shouldn't be joined up. And it's worth highlighting again that his approach wasn't to seek a gold standard in terms of survey versus administrative data versus national accounts data, but to use a word that features regularly in the book and in the discussion it gives rise to triangulate between these different sources, including indeed different surveys. And it's probably worth re-emphasizing that in light of the current very welcome interest among academics and statistics offices in reconciling estimates from surveys with national accounts aggregates, and in using administrative data, including from the tax system, to capture the top of the distribution and top income shares better than surveys tend to. So again, the point is made very forcibly in the book that surveys shouldn't be simply seen as, quote, the guilty party. Other sources are themselves subject to error and problems of definition. So it's about reconciling and learning from these various different sources of data rather than looking for the guilty party. The book's treatment of concepts and of how data needs to be treated applies across the board to rich and poor countries. But its discussion on measuring poverty specifically in rich countries, about which Tony thought so much throughout his career and had so much more to say, is, alas, uncompleted and all too brief, as John explained. See, it doesn't reflect then, among other things, the depth of Tony's thinking about poverty here in the UK, and also the time and effort he devoted to advancing poverty measurement and analysis at the European level, as has been mentioned. His commitment and contribution to improving the EU's social monitoring apparatus was enormously time and energy consuming, and he gave that willingly, and including designing indicators to monitor progress in fighting poverty and social exclusion across the European Union, work in which I had the privilege to be involved, along with Bea County and Eric Marlier. And the resonances between that work and this are multiple. As in thinking about global poverty across the world, Tony's starting point in thinking about social inclusion in a European context was to think through the principles that should guide it, bring out the limitations of the available data and indicators, make concrete recommendations for their improvement, and, as an aside, work very hard at the political level to make sure these were taken seriously and got their best shot of being adopted, but also to always remember and emphasize that the best was not to be the enemy of the good in promoting forward movement. So I was very struck by the national poverty reports, many of them for rich countries, that are included in the book and have been elaborated on by John and Andrea with Joe Hassel's help. And clearly the intention was to draw on these much more extensively, but bringing them together in the book is itself a very valuable contribution. The discussion around them serves to underline, as John emphasized repeatedly, the importance that Tony assigned to reconciling national poverty measures and those produced by international organizations, for the variety of reasons that he brought out. Fundamentally, in terms of the credibility and the bite, the purchase that they would have in having a concrete use and impact. And the other element there is the conviction that poverty in rich countries should not be forgotten when we think about poverty in a global context. And the degree of schizophrenia that is all too common in thinking about poverty in rich countries and globally had to be overcome, and that's in a sense a fundamental aim of the book. So as John brought out, he illustrates how one might apply a common approach with an income standard that above a certain threshold rises with average income. But again, characteristically, he's very careful to look at the sensitivity of the results to alternative assumptions, and indeed to make clear that this is one illustrative approach to be built on rather than in any sense an end point. So I was very struck by the alas heading without the following discussion in the final chapter that we know enough to act. And there's absolutely no contradiction between the care exercised here and that was advocated for the rest of us, the care that must be exercised in thinking about and producing estimates of poverty, that shouldn't be a barrier to action, on the contrary. John ended with the quote that the key is engagement of top politicians and policymakers. And I think that does go back to what might have been his central answer to the question, why is poverty so persistent in rich countries? And it's clearly significantly to do with political will. But of course, we can't blame the politicians. We're all responsible, and including for those we elect. But we are responsible for the generation of that political will. And in terms of engagement, researchers also have to play their part, including devoting attention to not always fashionable topics, such as data quality. And I guess being willing to lift our heads from the screen and engage with policymakers and broader societal debates to seek to improve the quality of policy formation and those debates. And we couldn't ask for a better role model than Tony in that regard, as exemplified once again in this book. So we'll now, let me get to a microphone, we'll now open it up for discussion. I'll first ask John if he has anything that he would like to say, having heard what he's heard, or whether we will open it up.
Only two very brief things. One is to emphasize that I thought both Sabina and Brian were very right to stress the long experience Tony had in his work on Europe and what that brought to the table in this book, which I don't think I made enough of in my own presentation. Both of them were quite right to emphasize that. And secondly, to thank them, not just for what they said today, but to thank them for what they did something like two and a half years ago, because Brian and Sabina put us in touch with Joe Hassel and Yang Shen, who we thank both of them at some length in our foreword, who played a vital role in providing us with assistance on the book. And so I'm grateful to you two. I'm very grateful to Joe and Yang.
Great. Okay, there are a couple of roving mics. So if you would like to catch my eye in the usual way and just introduce yourself as you start into your remarks or question.
Thank you. My name's Linda Bear, and I want to say thank you to the Atkinson family so much and the speakers. I've been based in Eastern Africa for 16 years, working with UNICEF and IDRC, the research arm of the Canadian government, now doing my DPhil studies in sustainable urban development. And I'd love to hear a bit of a response about, as we make a commitment to leaving nobody behind, where you see as there's still some of the greatest challenges in lack of visibility of poverty, and where both the granularity and maybe the geospatial dimensions of poverty still need to be pushed forward. I'm thinking of fragility, migrating populations, some of the demographic shifts that have gone on. Thank you.
I think I'll gather a couple of inputs and then we'll come to the stage. Yes, excuse me. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Frances Stewart, and I used to work in Oxford. I'm Emeritus. And I was I think you've done a magnificent job, and obviously I'm a huge admirer of Tony's work. I was very intrigued by this concept of limited sympathy principle, which I hadn't sort of thought of at all as something you should put into measurement. And it seems so inconsistent with the rest of the book, because if one did do it, the politicians say, oh, fine, I've got limited sympathy for those people over there. I've even got limited sympathy for people in the East End of London, and therefore poverty is really not so bad after all. So I just wonder how he could integrate that with the rest of his philosophy and the rest of all of our philosophy towards poverty.
So maybe I might ask Sabina to respond to the first question and John to the second, or you can toss it around amongst you as you wish.
Go ahead.
It would have been great to have had Tony apply that concept that he introduced in chapter 1 at the end of the book in chapter 10, and he signals in chapter 1 that that's what he's planning to do, but alas, we don't have that application. And to see that discussion and see the sensitivity of the numbers, what would with the same sort of weights applied, what would a count based in the UK, how that compare with a count based in the US or things like that. I think his basic point here, though, is a very simple underlying one, that by counting, and counting all the poor people across the world, we have to realise that we're giving them equal weight, and there must be in principle, some alternative to doing that. For the reasons you describe, it might not be necessarily an attractive alternative, but I think it was just that basic underlying idea that there's an ethical judgment if you weight everyone equally. That's what he was trying to get over.
In terms of leaving no one behind, I think there's really good sections of the book on, first of all, missing people. So, and it looks at, who's missing in Japan, and it's quite different groups. But the classic groups that are missing because they're institutionalized or because they're transient populations or whatever, and there's an attempt in the book to quantify in certain contexts how many million people those are. And so that remains a challenge for survey-based poverty work that's explicit. And another is that there's a recognition that even when there are surveys, there was a typhoon in this area or there's a conflict in this area, and so the survey data may not be complete, or PSUs may be replaced with primary sampling units in non-affected areas, and that may have some influence on the poverty estimations. And so I think those are the two aspects of the book which look at that. At the same time, there is an emphasis on disaggregation, not only by age, which is certainly there, but by other groups, which I think is what you're getting at. Yeah.
Could I add there on the challenges? I think the point that Brian made to emphasise about the engagement of politicians in the process, which I also closed on. I think that's the greatest challenge. I think Tony might say that's the greatest challenge. If we have we know enough to act, we've got to get the politicians more engaged. And so that poverty measurement, for example, becomes something that the Ministry of Finance is really interested in. It isn't something that's just left to the statistical office and we don't look at their numbers unless they're GDP or inflation. It's got to be something that's central to the political process.
Hi, my name is Rahul and I'm a Shivling Fellow and I come from India and most of my work is in basic income and unconditional cash transfers. My question to you was that you've been, you must have read all these, how people are measuring poverty across the world. I want to know if and how poor people are involved in making up these numbers. What is their role in making up these statistics?
Thank you. Take another one. Do you have it down the back there or around there?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Tom Reed. I'm a pupil at Snedwood School. I wanted to ask whether or not, because of the amount of sources of information that we can take about measuring poverty, do you think there should be a singular source in order to measure poverty using different indices? Because obviously we have the World Bank, we have the United Nations Development Programme. Should there be a singular source for measuring poverty, or do you think there needs to be a wide variety of sources in order to create different perspectives on poverty?
Should I take the last one first? Well, I think a single source might have the advantage in reducing confusion, but it might well have the disadvantage in restricting debate and encouraging different actors to get engaged, I think has got a better chance of bringing different perspectives. But at the same time, encouraging actors, individual actors to, as Sabina put it, quietly look around and keep their eyes open is very much what Tony was trying to do here, and that's the main thrust of the World Bank, the report for the World Bank that the book builds on, is to encourage the World Bank to move out of a rather blinkered approach to measuring poverty.
I think maybe just to follow up on that, again, with reference to the European experience, where Tony was a great believer in the possibility of countries learning from each other, of what mutual peer review and learning in Eurospeak. But one of the aspects of the way poverty measurement has evolved at the European level is that countries are challenged to demonstrate, using a common set of measures, how they've been faring, rather than being able to pick and choose the indicators that in some sense suit the case they want to make. So again, it's not about having just one set of agreed numbers, it's about countries being pushed to assess their progress or lack of same using a battery of indicators, but a battery of indicators that is shared across European member states. So that I think has been something of a shock for member states and has been a productive source of creative tension.
In terms of participation of poor communities, I mentioned that the work does reference what the kind of studies of which Voices of the Poor is the most well-known example. That is asking who in a community is poor and then gathering them, if they self-identify as poor, asking them to articulate the essence of the different deprivations that affect their lives, the sense of ill-being. And so that is part of measurement design. And the other touch point that I think is when he was giving the case of Mexico, he explained how not only that, but there was a legal process, there was a statistical process, and there were expert consultations, but the expert consultations weren't only academics and professors, but also what would be called in India activists, and so including people who work closely with those communities.
Thank you. One here, and...
Charles Godfrey. Inequality, in his penultimate book, Tony Atkinson put forward a whole series of recommendations for ending equality and removing poverty in high-income countries. And some of these obviously apply to middle and low-income countries. But did he have a theory of change, either in this book or in his other writings, of what specific could be done in low-income countries?
And another? Yep, I can see somebody here.
Hi, I'm Meng from Hong Kong. I have two questions. One is about inequality. Do you agree that we should set more concrete goal in reducing inequality? For example, income inequality, what is globally or nationally to set indicator, maybe Gini coefficient to reduce it in a certain period? The second one is about, I like the concept of multidimensional poverty, but sometimes I think it covered too many perspectives, including educational, health, and housing. So is it a bit confused if we use a concept to cover too many perspectives? Is poverty simply mean that a lack of well-being, that we need to cover all the dimensions? Yeah, thank you.
Maybe I'll take the easiest of those three questions while allowing John and Sabina to think about the hard ones. So in terms of the use of targets, I mean, I think Tony engaged very actively with target setting in a variety of contexts, including at European Union level, and he was very interested in the experience of my own country, Ireland, which was one of the first out of the blocks in terms of a government setting a concrete poverty reduction target. So he thought these absolutely had value in terms of, to use the phrase that's used a couple of times in the book, holding politicians' feet to the fire. But he wasn't unrealistic in how much one could achieve purely by target setting, and I think he saw it as part of a much broader strategy of improving poverty measurement, improving information about what could and should be done, and assessing whether progress was being made vis-a-vis the targets that governments themselves signed up for, and of course at national or European level, these targets themselves may often not be ideally framed. But they do represent a political commitment, as of course do the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think there was an absolute conviction that these have an important role to play, without thinking that setting the target is the same as achieving it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on the issue of goals reducing inequality very briefly. I mean, I suppose one might argue that any goal of reducing poverty, other things being equal, will reduce poverty because you're reducing inequality at the bottom of the distribution. So implicitly, you're reducing inequality that way. On the other hand, you have to be careful with that argument, because if you're reducing poverty through measures that require expenditure, you've got to finance that expenditure, and that may be taken from different parts of the distribution higher up. So that relationship between inequality and poverty and economic growth is exactly what Françoise Bourguignon's afterword is about the relationships in different directions. The issue of the theory of policy change for lower income countries, and whether Tony had a theory of that, again, for policy in the area of inequality or poverty, or... I think I'm going to pass that question sideways to my panel colleagues.
Keep it moving.
It didn't seem that in this book there were those kind of policy recommendations or a theory of change. In the linked Commission report monitoring global poverty, there were indeed a set of over 20 recommendations that were very clear. They were focused, they were universal, they were not limited to low-income countries, but they included them. But they were more focused on the mechanics of measuring and monitoring global poverty. So they were different in kind. In terms of too many indicators and they're being confusing, of the countries that were mentioned that had national multidimensional poverty measures, they had between 7 indicators in the case of Mexico, and I think in the list there are 14 indicators at the same time. And in how indicators and dimensions were to be selected, one source was international standards like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but the second source was national priorities, which could include plans or other documents in the sense that each indicator could already be an objective of policy action, but this was bringing them together in a different way and looking at the overlaps in the lived experience of those indicators. And so that question, to my memory, is not addressed about how many indicators, but a sense of being limited and of them having a priority for national reasons, in addition to simply belonging to an indicator was.
Fran Bennett, Department of Social Policy and Intervention. Thank you very much for a fascinating evening. I just wondered, particularly given what Sabina just said, whether to unpick a bit more what you all talked about, Tony, talking about, which is about the measurement of poverty leading to policy action. Because what Sabina just said was that the measurement could depend in different countries, and obviously the Sustainable Development Goals include poverty in all its dimensions according to national definitions. So Sabina was saying it could depend on national policy priorities. So how do you distinguish whether we're measuring what poverty is or whether we're actually determining the measurement of a particular policy issue that a country is interested in, which seems to me to be rather different from saying we're trying to find out what poverty is in order to tackle it? Do you see what I mean? There seems to me to be something of a tension there, which says either our focus is measurement of poverty or our focus is trying to find out more about a policy priority that a country has already got within that field.
And maybe we'd take one, yeah, and we might have to make this the last one.
Thank you. I'm a DPhil. My name is Yu Shizang, and I'm a DPhil in the Social Policy and Intervention Department. My question is, Sabina, you mentioned that climate change and poverty are the two shared challenges for our generation and probably the future. I wonder, is there any opportunity that, well, probably other people are thinking about the measurement is too complicated. I'm thinking about whether there's a way or the chance to conceptualize poverty taking climate change into consideration rather than parallel both of them as two challenges. Basically because for some lowland countries, the life is tougher, and that might even have impact on how they spend money, their consumption decisions, extra. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Sabina, do you want to address that last question, and then we'll toss the other one around between us, or please?
Yeah, in terms of the first one,
yeah.
I think we would probably recommend, so Abhijit Banerjee is quoted in the book as saying in the case of India at that point, 2013, it could have been useful to have perhaps an ethical poverty line that reflected, what should be in the intrinsic sense of what poverty is, and then the administrative line or the administrative definition that reflected what was actually feasible given the political and economic circumstances of the time. And so it seems that that's what you were asking, Fran, was just about the twofold, and that is, if I remember correctly, that's in part of the intrinsic section, the section on intrinsic poverty, but that's the expert.
I was going to try and tackle the question on climate change, which I'm not quite sure I fully understood, but I think the thrust of your question is really calling for integration of these two subjects, and in particular discussion of climate change having more focus on poverty. And that other people in the room, including David Hendry, who I think are a bit better judged to, better qualified to comment on that as far as the focus of the climate change debate is concerned. But I encourage you to read the afterword by Nick Stern in Tony's book, which addresses this very point. I'm making it clear that the poor are hit earliest and hit hardest by climate change, whether that's manifested in dramatic events, floods, for example, or whether it's just the slow grind of drought and desertification. It's the poor who suffer most. And that in the efforts to combat climate change and transition to a low carbon economy, there are many opportunities there for, as Nick makes clear in his essay, for inclusive growth policies. And he gives the example, for example, of, say, decentralized solar power. So here we have this technology that will allow rural poor to get electricity in a way they couldn't before. So there are plenty of ways in which these two topics can be brought together.
And maybe just coming back to your point, Fran, I'm put in mind of what Tony says in the introduction about the major influence that reading Abel Smith and Townsend's book, The Poor and the Poorest, had on him at an early stage in his career. And that, of course, used what was in effect an official poverty line, in other words, the social security rates in force at the time. And while Tony clearly wouldn't see that as in any sense a satisfactory measure of poverty in and of itself and on its own, he does emphasize how striking it was to learn that so many people were living below the supposed safety net level that the state had signed up to providing. So I guess the fact that it's not an encompassing measure of poverty doesn't mean that it doesn't have real value and bite as part of a broader armory of measures and indicators, which is again in the spirit, I think, very much of what this book is advocating. So I'll just take one last question, not to be mean, and then we'll have to finish.
So thank you. It was very enriching session. My question is about the ethical thing, particularly when the countries like India, where they administer these tools for measuring the poverty, sometimes the questions are not structured, or the process of asking the question, particularly with the poor. So it's not so sympathetic and it's not so sensitive. So I think somewhere some protocol is required, particularly for the countries like India, so that the poor people are not objectified. Because this question coming again with them and asking. So I'm coming from that, particularly from that part. So I think somewhere I would request you people so that to make a protocol so that the countries like India and poor people, again, they are not, this idea of poverty is not thrown on them. They are not objectified. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that point, which I think we'd all agree with, and certainly is absolutely in the spirit of the book. Okay, I think time is against us, and I'd like to end proceedings by, first of all, thanking John very warmly indeed for coming and presenting the book and describing it so clearly and so well, and all the work that he and Andrea did to bring it to that point. And as I said, we're very much in his debt. And I'd also like to thank Sabina, of course, for her very interesting and important reflections, and indeed for all the influence that her work has had on the work that Tony is discussing in the book, and that he cared about so much. So we'll give them a round of applause in a moment, but before you rush away, just to emphasize that just to the right here, there are not only refreshments but also copies of the book on display and for purchase. So thank you for coming, and thanks to the speakers.